Whether you're a first-time DM or you're just looking to start playing, running your own D&D games or other tabletop games, I think one of the things we all struggle with is how do we make something that's actually creative, you're engaged with, and that's going to be memorable for everybody. Whether it's yourself just running the games or your players too. Trying to make something that's memorable often is sort of tied to, the stories that we're crafting together, because stories, you could argue, they really boost our feelings and connections with our lives. It's part of a human experience, whether it's trust or compassion or empathy, all these things sort of connect us through stories and specifically shared experiences, stuff that you're creating together as friends and families or people you don't know, like an Adventures League one-shot type of thing. You're still telling a story with one another. These experiences can motivate us to work with others and positively and influence our social behavior. Because of this, stories have a unique ability to build connections, particularly when we share them with one another. So one of the things I would suggest is to make something memorable and engaging is take inspiration from other things like books, things like movies. They're excellent at sort of crafting a story in your own mind that you sort of want to tell, or give at least a framework for it without writing the whole story out ahead of time. If you're wanting to create a game or a session that's just about high fantasy, Lord of the Rings, things like that. If you want to, and be engaged in something that's a little grittier and tech futurish, stuff like Shadowrun, what about Blade Runner? Things like that. But there are a couple great books out there, many great books, especially about writing itself, but particular to role-playing and tabletop games. I would argue that The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler is an excellent one, and also The Heroes with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. Two great books about constructing stories around heroes, and specifically things like actually having characters in your own stories. One of the things I think to continue to think about, how do we make something that's engaging and memorable, is when we're making these stories, we don't necessarily have to write them all ahead of time, but we have to make sure that they're engaging to our players. One of the easiest ways to do that is to constantly ask ourselves why. Just because it's not good enough for your players when it will become sort of distracting and the story won't make any sense. The more you ask why, the deeper into the lore of the world you're going to get. You're going to get more into their own characters, their own motivations. You'll ask yourself, why is your villain doing this in the first place? Is he just doing it because he's air quote bad, or does he have some deeper reason for why he's doing it? Why can be an extremely powerful tool for sort of building something that's going to be memorable. One of the biggest things I think that we have to be mindful of when we're sort of trying to make something that's engaging is you have to keep the spotlight of the story and do your best to incorporate all the players throughout the games. Thinking of them and sort of orchestrating different scenarios of different scenes where different players have different times to shine, it'll help balance this all out. This will help give them sort of a gravity to the story and understand that they have influence, they have agency over who they're playing, and that they have an actual impact in the world. So how do we build some of these stories together? How do we let them be the influencers of these worlds? Some of these games will be played over the course of years as a campaign. Some of them will just be run as a one-shot or a public game where you're sitting down with the people you've never met ever before. But there's a couple ideas and a couple sort of theories that I think can help you construct, whether it's a one-time session or things in a bigger scope of a world. One of which is something called the Harmon Circle. It's a theory by Dan Harmon himself. Other writers and creative folk often will use this. It's a sort of a circle in essence where you can plant a story or a piece of it at one element, and then you sort of loosely fill in the other elements around this circle. So as you can kind of see from this example here, this is something where you could say, well, I want to start with something like maybe the players are entering in an unfamiliar situation, and you may go say, well, how are they going to adapt to it? How do they get what they wanted? Do they pay a heavy price? How do they return to their familiar situation? How have they changed? Are they now in a comfortable zone? And whether or not, I would argue, if you want to proceed clockwise or counterclockwise, you can at least sort of ask yourself loose questions about the world and how things will be designed around your players. Some other tools for thinking about how to engage players and make these stories memorable are, running one-shots for them. Think about a game session to session. You don't necessarily have to build a whole campaign out. One of the great things that are out there, there's immense amount of awesome one-shots that are out there, but there are also some really great ideas for how to structure one-shots if you just want to build them yourself around your own story and your own worlds. One of the things you want to do is you're going to want to assemble the player characters. If you don't have much time to prep, but you do need to know who they are and what they're doing. You need to find the style of the game. Is it a dark, macabre world? Maybe Cthulhu's involved, or it's another high fantasy game or something in the future that's kind of like a heist game. You have to create a plot hook, the reason for why they're here in the first place. What are they, going to be working against or towards? Think about developing a climax for them. What's the point of where they're going in their actions? Flesh out some of the key NPCs ahead of time. It's going to really help you to understand the depth and layering of the world that you can sort of add for your characters, so that when they encounter these people, you don't have to make it up all necessarily just on the fly. You don't have to incorporate the whole world. You don't have to think of every single person, but loosely think about scenes that they may encounter and what would be the NPCs that fill in those spaces. Think about preparing some social encounters. It doesn't necessarily always all have to be combat all the time. What are the reasons why they would have other options for overcoming some barrier or obstacle in their way? Maybe that's through social interactions. Again, thinking about how we make this engaging for the characters and the players at the table, make sure that you're trying to think about all the players and how do you have player-tailored challenges for them. So if you have a rogue, are they going to be able to sneak and lockpick through some of these things? Or if they're a warrior, are they going to simply want to just kick doors down? You have to think about, at least for all of them, how are they engaged in this content? At the end of the day, they all want loot. So think about what would be some of the loot rewards for them. Maybe specific to each of the players themselves, or something that would help the party down the road. Or if it's a one-shot, piles of gold. You definitely want to outline key locations that you're going to run into throughout this one-shot. Having the whole world built out is not important, but you definitely need to know point to point, more of as a point crawl. How are they going to get from one place to another? It's easy to railroad in these situations because, honestly, it's a one-shot, but you do need to have a sense of what the locations are going to be that they're going to. One of the worst things about a one-shot could be sort of this wandering intro. Sometimes you sit down to play and somebody's just talking for 5 to 10 minutes about this situation that, at the end of the night, you're barely going to remember sort of the lore background of the world. But if you can sort of tie it to the characters quickly, why they're there, what maybe one of them said just as a passing joke motivation to keep them tied to their character for that evening, that's going to sort of make the intro a little bit more concise. One of the biggest things you need to keep doing in these one-shots, especially for just an evening of fun, is you got to keep the pace moving. Don't dawdle too much. You got to keep sort of the action and sort of the story of everything flowing. Even if it's a one-shot, or we're thinking about the Harmon circle theory, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build something that's memorable together. You're co-creating something together. You want the players to feel like they have choices of their own, their agencies their own. If you've just built a story that is just you're forcing your own agenda, your long-winded sort of world that you've built in your own mind, and you've sat there for years and years and years and constructed and have all this expectation of how this is going to work, that's a really bad place to start. You need to have a sense that before you get started, you're doing something together. This is a fun endeavor. Players are going to care about their characters more than anything in the world, and that is essential. They love to talk about the amazing things that their characters do and that they will do, and that they care for them. Just blindly sticking to something is designed as not going to be enjoyable for the players, and it probably won't be enjoyable for you at the end of the day. Just because you've constructed something in your own mind's eye doesn't mean that your players are really going to be totally engaged with that content. Something that might be helpful to sort of balance your own sort of DMing or game master's expectations in your players is to sit down beforehand and think about, again, that you're co-creating this together. Never write a long game before you know the characters. Understanding their motivations, some of the things that they want to do, is really integral to building a world and a story together. Try to combine the players' backstories with their game master story to create something that's more engaging for the players themselves. And think about maybe making truths for your campaign or your session. Things like you see on the screen here. Something that would be played in maybe an Icewind Dale game is that the sun hasn't risen for 2 years. There's a 2-year night and it's cut off from the frozen north. And the rest of these options here that sort of encapsulate the world that these players are going to be in for a while or for a short period of time. If you can, run a session 0 for your players. One of the things that's really great about doing this is that it gives them the mental framework of the game that they're going to play, an opportunity for you and them to make the players together the adventures together so that everybody has a clear idea of what's going on. Maybe you want to introduce a patron so that your characters have an options for getting the game started, not always loosely having to cram them into a tavern together, but they have somebody who's basically giving them jobs to get started. Last element we're going to talk about, that when you're trying to make something creative and engaging for yourself and the players, is that the gameplay setting is going to establish sort of a loose framework for the game. The reason why this is important is that it sort of gives everybody an overarching expectation of where they're going to play, why they're going to be interested in sitting down and playing in an environment for at least a little while. But it's really important to sort of allowing the players to influence the story of their characters. It's going to give them a mental framework for where and how they're going to play with these characters. Sort of inviting everyone to this setting can set up sort of their expectations well ahead of the game and for the rest of the game. One of the great things you can do creatively is make maybe a homebrew setting. It's a great outlet for creative energy, and the process for creating this can be sort of cathartic and lead to other sort of creative endeavors for yourself and maybe for the players themselves. But one of the challenges with that is that because that's maybe being built over the course of time, it's not as clear. So maybe just sort of outlining and saying to everybody, hey, this is going to be something that's more like high fantasy, or it's like a noir film, or a heist, or a samurai environment, or sci-fi, or whatever, sort of gives them a headspace of what they're going to be doing together. One of the fun things you could think about too is that the setting doesn't necessarily have to be a single one. Maybe it's a combination of a few of those ideas, that it's like noir heist environment, but it's in historical Victorian London, and that there's been portals and time rifts ripped open from the future. It sounds pretty outlandish to me, but it could be really a fun environment for those who you're playing with. Hope you found some of these ideas helpful for making a game with your friends or your family, or maybe even for a one-shot, something that's actually engaging and memorable for not only yourself but your players. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.